Hello again, this is Lawrence Holgate, and this is episode 18 of Understanding Plato, based on the book of the same name, published in 2016 on Amazon.com. We had left off with the idea that philosophers should be kings, and we now want to know what it is that is needed to educate the kings. What is this magical thing that philosophers have that qualifies them to be kings in the ideal state called the Republic by Plato? We're going to start reading in my book at section 10.3. That's chapter 10, and at 10.3, called The Analogy of the Sun. Plato is going to use several analogies, a simile, an allegory, in order to help us understand this idea that philosophers should be kings, to tell us what it is that these philosophers need or have already that qualifies them to rule the city-state. Socrates begins the discussion of this first analogy that he's promised us, called the analogy of the sun, and he begins the discussion of the form of the good. We're in book 6 of Republic, by repeating the definition of a philosopher, or someone who has a philosophic nature, as a person who always loves the sort of learning that makes clear to them some feature of the being that always is, and does not wander around between coming to be and decaying. For example, the philosopher wants to learn about concepts. He wants to learn about forms. We today use the word concept. Suppose we want to learn about the form of justice, not about the many actions that are referred to as just or unjust by moralists or the majority when they evaluate their own conduct or the conduct of others. The philosopher wants to know about the form of justice, not particular acts of justice. In the same way, the philosopher wants to learn about the concept of beauty, the form of beauty, and not study the never-ending disputes over the evaluation of particular instances of art as beautiful or ugly. The philosopher instead wants to focus on the forms, on the concepts of justice and beauty, because as forms, as concepts, they are eternal and unchanging, whereas particular paintings are going to degrade someday. Just acts are going to occur or not occur. Now, of all the forms, both moral and non-moral, none is more important for the rulers to study than the form of the good, with a capital G. This is because, quote, it is by their relation to it, the form of the good, that just things and others become useful and beneficial. And Socrates goes on to say that we have no adequate knowledge of the form of the good. And if we don't know it, even the fullest possible knowledge of other things is of no benefit to us, any more than if we acquire any possession without the good of it. Now, the wording in the preceding quote, what I just quoted to you, leads us to conclude that the sense, the meaning of the word good, is non-moral, as in the sentence, the eye is good for seeing, or the sentence, the pruning knife is good for pruning vines. If the phrase just things and the others refers to justice in the city and justice in the individual soul, then Socrates means that merely knowing the form justice is going to be of no benefit until we know the form of the good. Only then will we know what justice and other forms are good for. Now, a possible objection to this is that Socrates has already said what justice is good for. Didn't he argue in Book 4 that justice in the city is each person practicing one of the pursuits in the city, the one for which he or she is naturally suited? And justice in the soul exists when each element within the soul does its own job, where ruling and being ruled are concerned. He further proclaimed that adherence to these arrangements in city and soul will bring about health and happiness to both. And in this respect, justice is good for both city and soul. Why should we and the guardian rulers need to know more about this, about justice? And yet Socrates insists that knowledge of the form justice is not going to be useful to either the individual or the rulers of the city until each knows the good of it. He addresses this warning especially to the guardian rulers. Here's what he says at paragraph 506 in Republic. I don't suppose, at least, that just and fine things will have acquired much of a guardian in someone who doesn't even know in what way they are good. And I divine that no one will have adequate knowledge of them until he knows this. Our constitution will not be perfectly ordered unless a guardian who knows these things is in charge of it, the philosopher king again. The way in which justice is said to be good in Book 4 doesn't really constitute adequate knowledge of this important form called justice. Well, what is it then about the good that Socrates wants the guardians, that is, the philosopher kings, to know? Let's take a look at the first of the three analogies, or similes. This one is called the sun, and the sun as an offspring of the good. Now, Socrates has earlier said what the good is not. It is not knowledge, and it is not pleasure. The hypothesis that the good is knowledge is rejected on the ground that those who believe this can't tell us what sort of knowledge it is. But in the end, they are forced to say that it is knowledge of the good, thereby arguing in a circle. In other words, what this comes to is just the claim that knowledge of the good is knowledge of the good. The second hypothesis, that good is pleasure, is rejected on the ground that those who make this claim are forced to admit that there are bad pleasures, and thus they have to agree on the contradictory assertion that a bad pleasure is also good. So the good is neither knowledge nor pleasure. Both of those ideas crash at this point. That's at paragraph 505b through d in Republic. Now, although Socrates knows what the good is not, he's unable to tell us through Glaucon what it is. Instead, he says he will only discuss what is an offspring of the good and most like it. Perhaps a study of the offspring will provide an alternative understanding of how knowledge of the form of the good will show us the benefit of justice in the other forms. Well, the offspring of the good is the sun. Socrates says that the good begot the sun as its analog. I don't think that the word begot means the same thing as she begot a child. He uses the word analog after all. So the good is, the sun is an analogy to the good. Let's see how that works. Here's what he says at 508c. What the good itself is in the intelligible realm in relation to understanding and intelligible things, the sun is in the visible realm in relation to sight and visible things. All right, so we're going to get an analogy now between understanding and intelligible things with sight and visible things. The light of the sun causes our eyes to see in the best way and the visible things to be seen. By analogy, the form of the good gives the objects of reason their truth and gives reason its knowledge of them. Quote, so that what gives truth to the things known and the power to know to the knower is the form of the good. And though it is the cause of knowledge and truth, it is also an object of knowledge. So there's the beginning of the analogy, the understanding. Well, the idea here is that in the intelligible sphere, the good itself it helps us understand and helps make things intelligible in the same way that the sun, well, not the same way, but the analogy is to the sun giving us the power to see, the ability to see, and visible things to be seen. To repeat, the light of the sun causes our eye to see in the best way and the visible things to be seen, and by analogy, the form of the good, the analogy now to the sun, gives the objects of reason their truth, and gives to reason its knowledge of them. Now, Professor Santos, who wrote a great deal on these passages, recommends that interpreters of Plato distinguish sharply between the earlier remarks about the relations between the form of the good and anything that is good, whether it's a form or a sensible thing, and what he is discussing here in the analogy of the sun. In the analogy, Plato is dealing exclusively with relations between the form of the good and other forms, and here's a quote from Santos in his 1980 book on the Republic. Thus, it is reasonable to suppose that it is the attributes of the forms as forms, or their ideal attributes, that is being explained or accounted for by reference to the form of the good, not their proper attributes, that is, the attributes that each form has by virtue of being the particular form it is. For example, when Socrates earlier discussed the usefulness of the form of the good, he was referring only to its relationship to the proper attributes of the form of justice, as defined by Socrates previously in Book 4. But in the analogy of the sun, the reference is to the relationship between the form of the good and the individual forms themselves. For example, justice with a capital J, circularity, beauty, and any other form that we would call good. Well, how do the forms as forms qualify as good? Santos suggests that this can be seen in the contrast between the forms and the sensible things that participate in them. The forms have ideal attributes that sensible things lack. For example, with respect to the form beauty, it always exists. It's neither generated nor destroyed. It does not increase or decrease. It exists by itself. Now we're talking about a form. We're talking about a concept. Let's use our contemporary word concept. The concept of beauty is never generated. It's never destroyed. It doesn't increase or decrease. It exists by itself. And in addition, in contrast to sensible beautiful things, the kind of beautiful things you and I see, the painting on the wall, for example, beauty itself is not beautiful in one respect and ugly in another. That is, the form beauty is not beautiful in one respect and ugly to another, nor beautiful at one time and not at another, nor beautiful in comparison to one thing and ugly in comparison to another, nor beautiful here and ugly there, or being beautiful for some and ugly for others. That's what happens to beautiful things in our real world, but it doesn't happen to the concept of beauty. And the same thing can be said of all the other forms, other than the form of the good. They are ideal exemplars. That's how they function. For on this assumption, the forms have something in common, namely, their being the best objects of their kind. So it is natural that there should be a form in virtue of which they have this in common. And in view of what this common feature is, it is natural that that form would be the good, the form of the good. This explains the analogy to the sun and its effect on visibility. As the sun makes objects visible, so the form of the good gives no ability, or understanding, if you will, to the forms. And the argument appears to be this. Again, I'm quoting from Santos. It is the ideal attributes of the forms that make them knowable. The essence of the forms consists in their ideal attributes, and an object must have these attributes in order to be knowable. The forms have these attributes only because they participate in the form of the good. Hence, it is ultimately the form of the good that makes all other forms knowable. And that's its function. Socrates makes the additional claim that the form of the good is like the sun, which, quote, provides visible things with the power to be seen, but also with coming to be, with growth and nourishment, although it is not itself coming to be. That would be preposterous, to say that the form of the good is coming to be. I'm not sure it's preposterous with respect to the sun, but let's give that to Socrates. Therefore, Socrates says to Glaucon, you should also say that not only do the objects of knowledge owe their being known to the good, but their very being or existence is also due to it. These other concepts would not exist were it not for their participation in the form of the good. And this prompts the question, if the word being does mean existence, then how does the form of the good cause the being of all the other forms? Well, we're going to have to look at Plato's next analogy or simile in order to answer this question. We're not going to do that now. We've gone through 15 minutes for the evening, and I think that's enough. We're going to start at, I'll start reading at in chapter 10, section 10.4. We'll talk next Monday about the simile of the line, which is very hard to talk about, by the way, because there is a graphic that is used in the Republic and that Plato used to describe the simile of the line, but I'll try my best to have you imagine it. And then we're going to do the famous allegory of the cave. I think that's the most fun, is to think is this wonderful allegory that Plato leaves us from 2,400 years ago, and people are still talking about it and still trying to interpret it. Maybe that's what makes it so much fun. Okay, we'll see you guys next week, and have a good week, and please listen in again. Thank you.